Hey everybody, Dr. Dan here, and the semester is quickly winding down. I want to cover chapter 13, which is our next chapter in the book, and it's more of this politics of slavery. So it opens up with an excerpt on Frederick Douglass, so make sure you read that because it talks about the Garrisonians, the party of Garrison, who was an abolitionist. And it's interesting because Frederick Douglass, along with Garrison, were both people that thought the only way to solve the slave issue was for the North to succeed from the South. And this is, before the Civil War, of course. So the reasoning behind this, and Lloyd Garrison even burnt the Constitution in public. Garrison and Frederick Douglass both agreed that the problem here was the Constitution. The Constitution, in their interpretation, was a pro-slave document in that it didn't outlaw slavery. So that was sort of their take on things at the time as people who were abolitionists. So I think most of you know what abolitionists are or who they are, but those are people that wanted to abolish slavery. So as you go through this chapter, you'll read about abolitionists and free soilers and other stuff, and you should certainly know about these terms as you move forward. So, the big take on this chapter, it starts in around 1840, and the economy is booming, especially in the North. Railroads are starting to expand. Canal transportation, although it's short-lived, is moving a lot of products. The reaper, the steel plow are really starting to add to the productivity of farms. So agriculture is booming. There are a lot of people and a lot of immigrants moving into cities, and the North grows both as an agricultural powerhouse and also as an industrial powerhouse. So the economy up north is booming, and in the South, not so much. So the people who are getting rich in the South are the large slave owners, and the economy is very uneven in the South. And the textbook, I think, does a pretty good job of pointing that out. There's also an interesting sidebar about Chicago in the book, and how Chicago in early 1800s was really nothing as far as, it was no city at all. And I just happened to mention in my reading notes, if you take a look at them, that Toledo was a lot bigger than Chicago in the 1830s. And there were a lot of boosters, people who tried to predict the economy and what was going to happen with the country, who thought Toledo, Ohio was poised to be a major city because of our location as a far west port, if you will, in the Great Lakes. Remember, the west of the country, the western portions of the country are just not developed yet. So we were considered west at that point in time. But with railroad transportation, Chicago really kind of took off and took over. But if you've ever heard of a gentleman named Brand Whitlock, here from Toledo, he was a big booster back then, and really was a person who was trying to get investors to come to Toledo because he really thought it was going to be the next big thing as far as industrial cities go. But Chicago, because of railroad transportation and because of its location closer to Western markets, grew considerably faster, and it's obvious today that Chicago is a major city. So that's interesting. One of the whole points of this slave economy stuff that we're reading about right now, and also the last chapter, which was about Manifest Destiny, was this notion that as the country expands out west, as we start to plat these territories and these new states that the United States won in the Mexican American War, such as California, New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado, all of those states, this really brought slavery forward as a political issue, because as these new territories formed, there were debates over, hey, is this going to be a slave state or a free state? So when you read about politics and the politics of slavery in this chapter, know that slavery was becoming a bigger issue as the country expanded, because who was going to decide whether a state could be a slave state or a free state, and that brought the issue into politics. And as soon as the issue got into politics, a lot of people took sides, whether they were abolitionist or pro-slavery. So I think the book does a pretty good job of that. It talks about the Fugitive Slave Act as well, so you should absolutely know what that is. And that's basically saying that if a slave escapes, from a plantation perhaps in the South and ends up in Ohio, which was a free state. Can the slave owner come into Ohio, a free state, and take the slave away? And the answer was yes. And of course, that was controversial because to some people, slavery wasn't just a state issue, but it was a moral and ethical issue, of course. So know what the Fugitive Slave Act is. And the other thing to consider there is the issue of nativism. So this idea in the early 1800s and running up to the Civil War that the country was terribly nativist. Even Germans and Irish and Catholics were looked upon as immigrants that were undesirables in this country. Catholicism was looked upon as sort of a degraded religion that took individualism away from people because there was this fear that the Catholics all just listen to the Pope and they're not going to be good, loyal Americans. So you can see how things have changed as far as immigration and religion for sure. But the interesting thing is that there's still this threat of nativism, which we're witnessing today with the Trump administration, perhaps, and the whole build the wall narrative that this country is still fearful of immigrants. So a lot of that narrative from history about how nativist we are and how racist the country seems to be sometimes, is still there. So as I always say, that the present is just, the history unfolding. So you can see that same sentiment today when it comes to not only Latinos, but also people that come in from the Middle East. There's still that thread of, hey, these are undesirable others and we don't want them here. And this goes way back to the early, or the first half anyway, of the 1800s. So keep that in mind. I think it's interesting. The book also talks about Bleeding Kansas. So that's this controversy when Kansas comes in, whether or not they're going to be a slave or a free state, and it's going to be left up to the people in the state. And a lot of people come in and basically raise hell on each sides, and there's bloodshed. So that's interesting to read. Make sure you know what the Dred Scott decision is. Dred Scott's really interesting because what is going on there is that a slave owner from the South moves up to Illinois, I believe, and brings his slave with him, Dred Scott. So now there's this slave living in a free state, but the slave is property of the slave owner who's also living in the free state. And the Supreme Court decides that a slave moving to a free state with his or her master is still a slave, and not because of any kind of legal decision regarding localism and whether or not territory is free or not, but regarding the fact that African American slaves have no rights whatsoever as citizens. So Judge Taney in the Supreme Court decided that Dred Scott was still a slave regardless of where he lived, if his owner still had hold of him and still was employing him or owning him, so to speak. So make sure you know what Dred Scott is. The chapter ends in 1860 with the election of Abraham Lincoln. You should probably know about the Lincoln-Douglas debates. It's really, this is an interesting chapter. It's a little slow in the middle, but as you get towards the end of it, I think it's pretty interesting to read about Lincoln. And Lincoln was originally a Whig and really converts to Republican. So now the Republican and Democratic parties back then were totally different than they are now. The Republican Party is basically the party of the North. It's the anti-slavery party. And the Democratic Party at that time was the party of the South that was pro-slavery. So obviously, the parties aren't anywhere near like they were back then, but you should probably know the alignment of the parties moving forward. So that's it for Chapter 13. We're quickly winding down. We get into the Civil War in the next chapter. But I think that the biggest takeaway here is this idea that fear of the other. And when I say the other, fear of foreigners, fear of people with religions that are maybe different than the majority, is something that certainly plagued the country in the first half of the 1800s and still does today. So I would argue that the present attitudes are directly related to this chapter 13 of the book. So that's it for now. Be safe, everybody. Have a great day and a great week, and I'll talk to you again real soon. Take care. Bye-bye.